You think being a princess would be awesome, right? Gorgeous dresses, adoring subjects, and servants at your beck and call. Well, get that Disney fantasy right out of your head. Because being a Tudor princess was basically signing up for a nightmare survival challenge that would make modern reality shows look like a day at the spa. Imagine this. One day you're literally the most important child in England, your father's pearl of his world. The next you're declared a bastard, stripped of your title, and forced to become a servant to your baby half-sister, the daughter of the woman who destroyed your mother. And if you complain, well, that could be treason, punishable by having your head chopped off. Welcome to the life of Princess Mary Tudor, where royal blood was less a privilege and more a death sentence hanging over your head. While modern teenagers might worry about social media likes, Tudor princesses marry. And Elizabeth worried about whether they'd survive the week, whether from disease, political schemes, or their own father's deadly temper. The sisters lived in a world where half of all children died before their 10th birthday, where even royalty could be executed on a whim, and where one wrong prayer could get you burned at the stake. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Okay, tonight it's Tudor princesses. But wait, are you comfortable? Duh, really. Check. Pillows, blankets, the whole deal. Where we're going, you'll want to be settled. So, congratulations. You just woke up in 1516, the year Mary Tudor was born. The scratchy wool blanket beneath you does nothing to soften the hard wooden bed frame. Your nose twitches at the smell of smoke from the hearth mixed with the musty aroma of damp rushes strewn across the floor. Outside you hear the servants already bustling about. Dawn has barely broken, but the day begins early in Tudor, England, even for royalty. No lazy mornings in your cozy memory foam bed here. Not when survival requires constant vigilance. When each day could be your last in the dangerous game of royal succession. When Mary Tudor was born on February 18, 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, England, her arrival was both a blessing and a disappointment. A blessing because after years of miscarriages and stillbirths, Queen Catherine of Aragon had finally produced a living child. A disappointment because that child wasn't the male heir King Henry VIII so desperately wanted. Still in these early days, Henry doted on his daughter. Mary was proof that he and Catherine could have children. Surely a son would follow soon. For now, this fair, ruddy-cheeked little girl with Tudor red hair was the apple of her father's eye. She had the finest education a girl could expect at this time, records tell us. Mary spoke Latin, French, and Spanish fluently. She played the virginals and lute beautifully. She danced with grace and poise beyond her years. She was being groomed not as a ruler. No one imagined England would have a queen pregnant, but as a valuable marriage piece in the European royal chess game. By age 9, Mary was sent to Lello Castle to preside over the Council of Wales, effectively acting as Princess of Wales, though never officially given the title. Her household was grand with dozens of servants, tutors, ladies-in-waiting, and guards. Her days followed a strict routine. Prayers at dawn, breakfast of bread and ale, lessons in languages and music. More prayers, a formal midday dinner, afternoon needlework or music, evening prayers, a light supper, and bed. This wasn't the soft, pampered life you might imagine. Mary's rooms, though the finest available, were drafty and cold. In winter, Even royal chambers dropped to freezing temperatures with only smoky fires for warmth. She slept not on a plush mattress, but on a rope bed with a straw-filled mattress, though as royalty. She at least had the luxury of linen sheets and fur coverings. Mary's mother made sure her daughter's education was exceptional, especially for a girl. Catherine of Aragon had been raised by Isabella of Castile, a formidable queen in her own right, who believed in educating women. Under tutors like Juan Luis Vive, Mary studied classical literature, church fathers, philosophy, and scripture, a curriculum usually reserved for boys. But the seemingly secure world of Mary's childhood was built on shifting sands. By the 1520s, it became increasingly clear that Queen Catherine would not produce a male heir, and Henry's eye had begun to wander, specifically to one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't like the king's previous mistresses. She refused to sleep with him outside of marriage. And more dangerously, she had evangelical religious leanings, introducing Henry to texts that suggested his marriage to Catherine. His brother's widow had been invalid from the start. This idea took root in Henry's mind, feeding his growing conviction that God was punishing him for an unlawful marriage by denying him a son. What followed was a slow-motion disaster for Mary. Her father's great matter, his quest for an annulment, dragged on for years. The Pope refused to invalidate the marriage. Henry, growing ever more desperate and tyrannical, eventually broke with Rome entirely, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and had his own newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, grant the annulment. In May 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen. She was already pregnant. On September 7, 1533, she gave birth, not to the promised son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. For Mary, now 17, the world collapsed. Her father declared her illegitimate, stripped her of her royal title, and removed her from the line of succession. She was no longer Princess Mary, but merely the Lady Mary, a humiliating demotion. Her household was dissolved, her loyal servants dismissed, but the cruelest blow was yet to come. Mary was sent to Hatfield House to join the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, not as a sister, but as a lady-in-waiting. The once heir to the throne was now expected to serve the child who had replaced her. Mary refused to accept this new reality. She would not acknowledge Anne as queen or Elizabeth as princess. This defiance enraged Henry, who was becoming increasingly tyrannical as his reign progressed. The relationship between father and daughter deteriorated to the point where they didn't speak for 3 years. Under mounting pressure, Mary fell ill frequently. The royal physician attributed her ailments to ill treatment. She was kept under virtual house arrest. Her movements restricted, isolated from friends and supporters. She was forbidden from seeing her mother, who had been banished to various damp, uncomfortable castles far from court. Anne Boleyn, meanwhile, showed no kindness to her stepdaughter. Some accounts suggest she even plotted to have Mary poisoned, though this may be later propaganda. What's certain is that Anne saw Mary as a threat, a focal point for those who opposed her marriage to the king and supported the old Catholic ways. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbleton Castle. Mary was inconsolable at the news, but was denied permission to attend her mother's funeral. She grieved alone at Hunsdon House, surrounded by spies who reported her every word and action to the king. But the wheel of fortune was about to turn again. Anne Boleyn had failed to produce a son, and Henry's affections had already moved to Jane Seymour. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king. She was beheaded on May 19th, and Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate, just as Mary had been. The two half-sisters, both now officially bastards, shared a strange new kinship in their disgrace. When Jane Seymour gave birth to the long-awaited son, Edward, in October 1537, Mary, who had finally submitted to her father's demands and acknowledged his supremacy in the church, was named godmother and carried the infant prince at his christening. For Elizabeth, barely 4 years old, these events were confusing and frightening. Her mother had disappeared, never to return. Her status had changed overnight. While too young to understand fully, she was old enough to sense the danger that swirled around her. From her earliest memories, Elizabeth learned that favor was fleeting. Security an illusion, and survival required careful calculation. Unlike Mary, who was raised as a princess in a relatively stable household until her teens, Elizabeth never knew such security. She was declared illegitimate before she could form memories of being a recognized princess. From infancy, her world was one of uncertainty and peril. Elizabeth's daily life as a small child was still privileged by ordinary standards. She had her own household at Hatfield House, staffed with servants and tutors. Her material needs were well met: fine clothes, good food, warm fires. But the emotional landscape was barren. Without a mother, with a distant and dangerous father, and surrounded by political intrigue, young Elizabeth developed a careful, watchful nature. Lady Bryan, who had previously been Mary's governess, now cared for Elizabeth. She wrote anxiously to Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, begging for proper provisions for the child, who had outgrown her clothes. Even basic necessities required bureaucratic approval now that Elizabeth was no longer officially a princess. Mary, despite her own troubles, developed a protective relationship with her little half-sister. Though Elizabeth represented the woman who had caused her so much pain, Mary seemed able to separate the child from the mother. When she visited Elizabeth's household, it was said that only Mary could soothe the toddler's tears. By age 4, Elizabeth began her formal education. Like Mary before her, she was taught by excellent tutors, including Roger Ascham, who described her as having the most acute mind and diligent spirit. Elizabeth showed an extraordinary aptitude for languages, eventually mastering French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and Latin. The sisters' early relationship was thus complex, marked by the vast age difference, 17 years. Their shared experience of falling from royal favor and the shadow of their mother's rivalry. Mary, deeply Catholic like her Spanish mother, tried to influence Elizabeth's religious upbringing. But Elizabeth, raised under the new Protestant regime, would develop very different spiritual leanings. The physical conditions of their lives reflected the precarious nature of Tudor existence. Even royal residences were plagued by problems we would find intolerable today. Sanitation was primitive: chamber pots and closed stools. Early versions of toilets were emptied manually, often into rivers that also provided drinking water. Bathing was infrequent, though contrary to popular belief, Tudor did care about personal hygiene. They changed their linen garments regularly and washed faces and hands daily. Disease was a constant threat. Sweating sickness, malaria, then called smallpox, and tuberculosis claimed lives at all levels of society. Infant and child mortality was devastatingly high. Medical treatments were based on the theory of 4 bodily humors and often involved bloodletting, purges, and herbal remedies of questionable efficacy. Diet varied dramatically by social class. As royal children, Mary and Elizabeth ate well: fresh meat, beef, mutton, pork, game, fish, bread, cheese, eggs, and seasonal fruits and vegetables. They drank watered wine or ale, as water was correctly considered unsafe. But food safety was still a serious concern. Without refrigeration, meat and fish spoiled quickly. Food poisoning was common, sometimes fatal. The sisters' education included practical household management. Both were taught to oversee large domestic establishments, manage accounts, and supervise servants. They learned needlework, music, dancing, and riding, all essential accomplishments for Tudor ladies of rank. But more than anything, both Mary and Elizabeth learned early the harsh lesson of royal vulnerability. Their father had broken with centuries of tradition, changed England's religion, executed wives and nobles, and disinherited his own children, all in pursuit of dynastic security. Neither daughter could ever feel truly safe. As Edward grew from infancy to childhood, both sisters worked to maintain good relationships with their little brother, the heir to the throne. Mary sent him gifts and letters. Elizabeth, closer in age, sometimes joined his household for lessons. But religious differences were already creating tension. Edward was being raised as a staunch Protestant, his tutors reinforcing the Reformed faith Henry had reluctantly begun. Mary, now in her 30s, maintained her Catholic devotion despite the danger. She had a private chapel where she heard Mass, technically illegal under the new religious settlement. Elizabeth, more pragmatic or perhaps more naturally inclined toward Protestant ideas, adapted more readily to the religious changes. In 1543, Henry married his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, a cultured, intelligent woman who worked to reunite the royal family. She persuaded Henry to pass the Third Succession Act, which restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, though they remained legally illegitimate. This gave the sisters some security, though their positions remained vulnerable to their father's whims. Mary, approaching 30, was still unmarried. Unusual for a woman of her rank, various marriage negotiations had fallen through over the years as her status rose and fell with her father's favor. She lived primarily away from court, managing her own household with the income from estates granted by the king. Elizabeth, now about 10 years old, joined Catherine Parr's household, where she received an exceptionally progressive education. Catherine supported female learning and surrounded herself with educated women. Elizabeth thrived in this environment, developing the formidable intellect that would later serve her so well as queen. The relative stability of these years ended with Henry VIII's death on January 28, 1547. Edward, not yet 10 years old, became King Edward V, 6. Real power lay with his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who became Lord Protector. For Mary, now 31, and Elizabeth, 13, their brother's reign would bring new challenges, new dangers, and a deepening religious divide that would set the half-sisters on a collision course. But that story belongs to the coming twilight. As we continue our journey through the perilous, fascinating world of Tudor royal siblings, where being a princess was less a fairy tale and more a fight for survival. The January morning dawned bitterly cold as messengers raced through the frost-covered countryside. King Henry VIII was dead. The mighty Tudor monarch, who had broken with Rome, married 6 women, and reshaped England forever, had finally succumbed to his failing health on January 28, 1547, for his daughters. Mary and Elizabeth, this news brought a complex mix of grief, anxiety, and possibility. The new king, 9-year-old Edward VI, was barely old enough to dress himself, let alone rule a kingdom. Real power immediately fell to his maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, who promptly had himself named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset. The political landscape shifted overnight, and with it the precarious positions of the two Tudor princesses. Mary, now 31, received the news at her estate of Hunsdon. She would have known what was coming next, a religious revolution. Edward had been raised by fiercely Protestant Tudors, who had instilled in him a zealous commitment to reform. Mary's private Catholic worship, barely tolerated under her father, would now become a dangerous liability. Elizabeth, just 13, was staying with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, when her father died. The teenage princess dropped to her knees and wept upon hearing the news. But unlike Mary, Elizabeth had been raised in the Reformed faith. The religious changes to come wouldn't challenge her conscience, though they would soon present other dangers. Both princesses attended their brother's coronation in February, a lavish spectacle where the small boy disappeared beneath heavy robes and an oversized crown. Mary, as the eldest, took precedence riding through London in a crimson velvet litter. Elizabeth followed in her own procession. The sisters presented a united front to the public, though privately their different religious convictions were already pulling them apart. Life in Tudor. England during Edward's reign became increasingly uncomfortable for Mary. Each morning she would rise before dawn for private prayer using her Catholic devotionals, books that were now technically illegal. Her loyal household staff protected these forbidden practices, keeping watch while she heard Mass in her private chapel. Discovery could mean imprisonment for her servants and worse trouble for Mary herself. While Mary struggled with her conscience, Elizabeth thrived under the new regime. She had the good fortune to be taken into Catherine Parr's household at Chelsea, where the Dowager Queen had created a haven of learning. Elizabeth's daily routine was structured around intense study, rising at dawn for prayers, then hours of languages, rhetoric, history, and theology with her tutor, Roger Ascham. The physical conditions of aristocratic Tudor households remained challenging even for princesses. Winter mornings meant waking in freezing rooms where servants would hurry to light fires. Water and basins might be crusted with ice. Unlike most ordinary people who slept on straw pallets on the floor, the princesses had proper beds with feather mattresses on rope supports that needed regular tightening. The origin of sleep tight, but even royal beds harbored fleas and bedbugs, leading to the familiar ending, "Don't let the bedbugs bite." "When I call her at her book," wrote Roger Ascham of Elizabeth, "she is loath to leave her study." The princess would often read by candlelight until late, straining her eyes but feeding her hungry mind. This studiousness wasn't just academic passion, it was survival strategy. In Tudor England, especially for royal women, intelligence was armor. Mary's education had been equally rigorous in her youth, but now her focus was on maintaining her religious practices while navigating the increasingly Protestant court. Her days included not just prayers but management of her substantial household, overseeing accounts, settling disputes among servants, responding to petitions from tenants on her lands. The sisters' lifestyles had much in common despite their differences. Meals followed similar patterns in both households. Breakfast was simple, perhaps bread with butter and ale. The main meal came at midday, what they called dinner, with multiple dishes served for aristocratic tables. Evening supper was lighter. Princesses would have eaten from put plates with knives and spoons. Forks were still considered an exotic Italian affectation. They wiped their hands on linen napkins and used trenches, stale bread plates to soak up sauces. While Mary and Elizabeth's positions seemed secure under Edward's reign, the religious tension between them grew. Somerset's Protestant reforms accelerated rapidly. Latin Mass was abolished. Church walls were whitewashed, covering centuries of colorful paintings. Stained glass windows were smashed. Religious statues were pulled down. For Mary, this destruction of sacred objects was sacrilege. For many ordinary people, it was bewildering and frightening. Mary refused to comply with the new religious laws. She wrote to her brother, appealing to family loyalty. "I appeal to your Majesty's own nature, whether it be seemly that I, your Majesty's humble sister, should be forced in matters of religion against my conscience." Edward, however, was developing strong religious convictions of his own. At 11 years old, he wrote back coldly that her fault is the greater because she ought to know better. Elizabeth took a different approach. While she had been raised Protestant, she understood the danger of rigid positions in Tudor England. She became adept at presenting herself as religiously conforming, while keeping her personal beliefs private, a strategy that would serve her well throughout her life. Unlike Mary, who couldn't bear to betray her Catholic faith, Elizabeth was pragmatic to her core. By 1549, tensions had escalated. The Privy Council, Edward's governing body, tried to bully Mary into religious compliance by arresting her chaplain. Mary stood firm, even as her household was picked apart. She wrote to her cousin, Holy Roman Emperor Charles I Thor, begging for intervention.
Oh.
Charles threatened war if Mary couldn't worship as she pleased. Faced with this international pressure, the council reluctantly backed down, while Mary battled openly. Elizabeth watched and learned she had seen the downfall of Edward's first protector, Somerset, replaced by the more dangerous John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. She observed how Northumberland systematically removed potential rivals, consolidating power around himself and the young king. When Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, Elizabeth lost her most powerful protector. Worse followed. Thomas Seymour, Catherine's husband and Edward's uncle, had been behaving inappropriately with teenage Elizabeth while his wife was pregnant. After Catherine's death, he plotted to marry Elizabeth and seize power. The scandal engulfed Elizabeth, who was interrogated for days about her relationship with Seymour. Though she maintained her innocence with remarkable composure for a 15-year-old, the experience was traumatic. The Seymour affair taught Elizabeth a harsh lesson about vulnerability. She wrote to her brother's council, "I am more bound to your honors for your protection than for all the world besides, and have no hope but in God and you." She crafted this carefully, presenting herself as dependent on their goodwill, while subtly reminding them of her royal status. Daily survival in Tudor England wasn't just about political maneuvering. Disease remained a constant threat. The sweating sickness that had periodically ravaged England since 1485 could kill within hours. Smellicks left survivors scarred for life if they were lucky enough to survive. Even minor ailments could turn deadly without effective medicine. Tudor medicine combined herbal remedies, prayer, and dangerous practices like bloodletting. Physicians believed illness resulted from imbalanced humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments aim to restore balance, often through painful purges. For toothaches, they might use cloves or honey mixed with wine. For headaches, lavender or rosemary. More serious conditions received more desperate remedies. Mary suffered frequent health problems, debilitating headaches and menstrual issues that today might be diagnosed as endometriosis. Tudor treatments would have included bloodletting and herbal teas, offering little relief. Elizabeth enjoyed better health but developed migraines and stomach complaints during times of stress. Physical manifestations of the psychological pressure she lived under. Food safety was another daily concern. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. Fish, often required on the numerous fast days mandated by both Catholic and Protestant calendars, was particularly problematic. Even royal households weren't immune to food poisoning. The sisters' meals were carefully prepared by trusted servants, tasted for poison, a real concern in royal circles, and blessed before eating. As Edward's reign progressed, his own religious fervor intensified. By 1552, the Second Book of Common Prayer pushed England toward a more overtly Protestant liturgy. Mary's position became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, Edward himself was showing signs of the illness that would eventually kill him, likely tuberculosis. His constant coughing, fever, and weight loss couldn't be hidden from the court. Mary visited her brother when protocol demanded, but these occasions grew tense. At Christmas 1552, they quarreled openly about religion in front of the entire court. Both ended up in tears. Edward, now 15 and trying to assert his authority, was frustrated by his sister's defiance. Mary, nearly twice his age, couldn't accept religious instruction from a boy she still saw as a child. Elizabeth navigated these shells with remarkable skill for a teenager. She maintained a warm correspondence with her brother while avoiding direct religious confrontation. She dressed modestly in Protestant fashion without the elaborate clothes and jewelry Mary favored. She created an image of herself as a serious, pious young woman, unthreatening to the regime, but still unmistakably royal.
Ow.
By early 1553, Edward's health was clearly failing. The vultures began to circle. Northumberland, desperate to maintain his power, convinced the dying king that allowing Mary to succeed would undo all his religious reforms. Edward, fevered and frightened for his Protestant legacy, agreed to change the succession. He bypassed both his sisters in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, conveniently married to Northland's son. This device for the succession was legally dubious at best. It contradicted Henry VIII's will and the Third Succession Act of 1544, which had restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. But Edward was king, and in Tudor England, the monarch's word was law, at least while they lived. Word of these machinations reached Mary through her network of spies at court. She began making preparations, contacting loyal supporters, securing funds, readying herself to fight for her birthright. Elizabeth, as usual, played a longer game. She stayed quiet, watching, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. In the background of these royal dramas, ordinary Tudor life continued. Summer brought relief from the cold, but new health hazards as sewage festered in the heat. The smell in London became unbearable by July. Contemporaries described it as a sweet stink. Those who could, including the royal family, escaped to country palaces where the air was cleaner. Food in summer included more fresh vegetables and fruits, peas, beans, apples, cherries, supplementing the constant bread and meat. The princesses' households preserved summer abundance for winter use. Fruits became conserved, vegetables were pickled, herbs dried. Nothing was wasted in Tudor England, where famine remained a living memory. The material contrast between royal life and common experience was stark. While Mary and Elizabeth wore silk and velvet, changed their linen shirts daily, and ate from silver plates, ordinary people wore wool and linen that might be washed monthly at most. They ate from wooden trenches and slept multiple people to a bed, and even for princesses, Tudor life lacked basic comforts we take for granted. No running water, central heating, or effective medicine. By July 1553, Edward was slipping away. His cough had worsened, his legs swollen, his breathing labored. Rumors spread that he had been poisoned, though modern historians believe tuberculosis the most likely cause. Northumberland kept the king's conditions secret as long as possible, buying time to position Lady Jane Grey for succession. Mary received intelligence that her brother was either dead or nearly so. She didn't wait for official notification. Understanding that speed was essential, she fled her residence at Hunstanton, riding hard for her estates in East Anglia, where her support was strongest. When messengers arrived to arrest her, they found she had already escaped. Elizabeth, meanwhile, pleaded illness and remained at her house at Hatfield. This calculated move kept her from being associated with either Mary or Lady Jane Grey. At 19, she had learned when action was needed and when patience served better. With Mary and Northland headed for confrontation, Elizabeth kept her options open. On July 10, 1553, Edward V/VI died at Greenwich Palace. Northumberland kept the death secret for 3 days, while Lady Jane Grey was brought to the Tower of London and proclaimed queen. Jane, a brilliant, devout 16-year-old, was as much a pawn as a player in this power grab. She reportedly accepted the crown with reluctance, fainting when first presented with royal robes. Meanwhile, Mary had reached her castle at Framlingham in Suffolk and raised her standard as rightful queen. Support flooded in from Catholics, conservatives, and those who simply believed in legitimate succession regardless of religion. Common people who had never met Mary rallied to her cause. The daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a true Tudor by blood. For Mary and Elizabeth, Edward's death marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. One that would test their relationship to its limits. The cautious, sisterly bond they had maintained despite religious differences would soon face its greatest challenge. The elder princess was about to become England's first undisputed queen, while the younger would have to navigate the most dangerous waters yet. The story of their changing fortunes from princesses to queen and heir would reshape not just their own lives, but the future of England itself. The summer air hung heavy with dust as riders thundered along England's rooted roads. Messages flew between towns and villages, noble houses and humble farms. Edward was dead. Lady Jane Grey had been proclaimed queen, but Mary Tudor, the late king's half-sister, had raised her standard at Firmingham Castle, declaring herself the rightful monarch. Ordinary people made extraordinary choices in those July days of 1553. Farmers left fields mid-harvest. Townsmen armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. Women packed food for husbands and sons, heading to join Mary's growing army. This wasn't just about religion or politics. It was about what felt right. The daughter of Henry VIII deserved the crown, not the granddaughter of Henry's sister, in a transparent power grab by the Duke of Northland. In her stronghold at Framlingham, Mary received a stream of nobles and gentry, arriving to pledge support. Her household had swelled from a few dozen loyal servants to thousands of armed men. For the first time in her life, the cautious, dutiful princess was taking a tremendous risk. She had declared herself queen without waiting for official proclamation. If she failed, it would mean the executioner's axe. "I will put down that wretched Jane and her party," Mary promised her supporters. The soft-spoken, pious woman had found an iron core when pushed to extremes. She issued proclamations in her own name, appointed officers, and prepared for civil war if necessary. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained at her house at Hatfield, supposedly too ill to travel. This convenient illness kept her from having to declare for either Mary or Jane. A smart move for a 19-year-old who had grown up watching royal favor shift like quicksand. When pressed, she sent a non-committal message to Mary expressing hopes for her good success in all your affairs. Notice she didn't actually acknowledge Mary as queen. Elizabeth was nothing if not careful. In London, support for Queen Jane crumbled almost immediately. The merchants closed their shops. People refused to cheer for her. Northumberland could unraise an adequate army because ordinary citizens would unfight against Henry VIII's daughter. Even the weather seemed to turn against Jane. A thunderstorm was seen as divine disapproval of her proclamation. By July 19th, just 9 days after Edward's death, the Privy Council in London switched sides, proclaiming Mary the rightful queen. Northland surrendered without a fight. Lady Jane Grey, queen for just 13 days, was imprisoned in the Tower, along with her young husband. Mary rode toward London in triumph, her supporters swelling to nearly 30,000 by the time she reached the city. Now it was Elizabeth's turn to make her move. The strategic illness miraculously cured. She gathered 1,000 horsemen, an impressive show of force, and rode to meet her sister outside London. On July 29th, the princesses made their formal entry into the capital together, presenting a powerful image of Tudor unity. Elizabeth, dressed in simple elegance, kept slightly behind her elder sister. Mary, garbed in rich velvet and wearing her mother's Spanish jewels, looked every inch a queen. The contrast between them was striking. The 7-year-old Mary, short and increasingly stout, the 19-year-old Elizabeth, tall and slender, with her father's red gold hair. But for this moment, they were united as Tudor sisters, claiming their birthright. Mary's coronation on October 1st, 1553, was a magnificent spectacle. The first coronation of an undisputed queen in English history. Elizabeth played her part perfectly, carrying the crown during the procession. The sisters seemed to have reached a genuine reconciliation. Mary appointed Elizabeth heir presumptive and granted her precedence over all other ladies at court. But the honeymoon period wouldn't last. Mary was determined to restore Catholicism in England. While Elizabeth had been raised in the Reformed faith, though the younger sister attended Mass with appropriate outward reverence, she remained Protestant at heart, and Mary knew it. Daily life at Mary's court followed ancient traditions. The Queen rose early for prayers, attended Mass, then dealt with state business. Meals were formal affairs with elaborate ceremony. Mary, despite her power, maintained traditional feminine occupations. She was an accomplished embroiderer and musician. Her Spanish mother had taught her that a woman could be both powerful and traditionally feminine. Court living arrangements reflected strict hierarchy. Mary had the best chambers with private withdrawing rooms. Elizabeth, as heir presumptive, had impressive accommodations but less privacy. Ladies-in-waiting slept in the Queen's chamber or antechamber, sometimes on trundle beds, pulled out at night. Even royalty rarely slept alone. Attendants were always within call. Health concerns remained constant. The Thames, London's main water source, was also its main sewer. Water was unsafe to drink, so everyone from queen to commoner drank ale or wine instead. Royal households had food tasters to check for poison. But they couldn't protect against the general bacterial hazards of Tudor cuisine. Stomach complaints were chronic, especially in summer when food spoiled quickly. Hygiene practices weren't as primitive as we might imagine. Both Mary and Elizabeth changed their linen undergarments daily. They washed faces and hands regularly and used cloths dampened with scented waters to refresh themselves. Full immersion baths were rare, but dry cleaning methods kept outer garments reasonably fresh. Brushing, airing, and exposure to herbs and smoke. The sisters' relationship seemed cordial in these early months. They dined together, played cards, and shared music. Both were accomplished musicians. Mary treated Elizabeth with affection, calling her sister and seeming to enjoy her company. For her part, Elizabeth was the model of respectful deference. Behind this harmonious facade, however, religious tensions simmered. Parliament repealed Edward's Protestant legislation. The Latin Mass returned. Married priests were ordered to leave their wives. Each change tightened the knot of anxiety for Elizabeth and other Protestants. In the broader country, these religious shifts created deep uncertainty. Ordinary people had lived through Henry's break with Rome, Edward's Protestant reforms, and now Mary's Catholic restoration, all within 20 years. Many simply adapted outwardly, while keeping their true beliefs private. Others held firm to their convictions despite the risks. For Tudor people, religion wasn't just about Sunday worship. It permeated every aspect of daily life. Prayer marked the hours. Religious holidays structured the year. Saints' days determined when you worked and when you rested. Even eating patterns followed religious rules. Fast days prohibited meat but allowed fish, creating the rhythm of Tudor meals. The physical environment reflected these religious changes. Church interiors transformed repeatedly, rich with images and incense under Catholicism, austere and whitewashed under Protestantism. Mary ordered the restoration of altars, statues, and ritual objects. Parish churches scrambled to comply, digging up hidden treasures or commissioning new ones at great expense. While these religious matters occupied Mary's government, ordinary Tudor life continued. Women rose before dawn to light fires and begin household tasks. Men worked in fields, workshops, or counting houses, depending on their station. Children helped from an early age. Tudor childhood was brief with adult responsibilities beginning around age 7 for all but the nobility. Food remained central to daily survival. Bread formed the foundation of every meal. A working man might consume 2 pounds of bread daily, accompanied by cheese, ale, and seasonal vegetables. Meat appeared more frequently on Tudor tables than in earlier centuries, but quality varied dramatically by social class. The royal household consumed vast quantities of meat. Records show Mary's court required 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 760 calves, and 1,270 pigs annually, not counting poultry and fish. For most Tudor people, warmth and light were precious commodities. Winter days meant working by whatever natural light filtered through small windows, with perhaps a few precious candles for essential tasks after dark. Only the royal court and wealthy households could afford the extravagance of numerous candles and roaring fires in multiple rooms. Mary and Elizabeth, of course, enjoyed the best available comforts. Their chambers would have been well lit and relatively warm, though still drafty by modern standards. They slept on feather mattresses with fine linen sheets and fur coverlets. Their meals featured the freshest ingredients and exotic imports. Sugar, spices, citrus fruits that ordinary people never tasted. Despite these luxuries, both women faced health challenges common to their era. Mary suffered increasingly from what modern doctors suspect was ovarian cysts or uterine cancer. Tudor physicians had no effective treatments for such conditions. Elizabeth experienced migraines and digestive complaints, likely stress-related as her position grew more precarious. The turning point in the sisters' relationship came with Mary's decision to marry Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V Parliament, and the public strongly opposed the match, fearing England would become a Spanish satellite. For Elizabeth, the prospect was particularly alarming. Philip was a devout Catholic committed to extinguishing Protestantism. Rumors began circulating that Elizabeth was involved in plots against her sister. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in early 1554, supposedly to prevent the Spanish marriage. Although Wyatt specifically exempted Elizabeth from his plans, Mary's counselors suspected her involvement. When the rebellion was crushed, Elizabeth was summoned to court to answer questions. Her journey to London in February 1554 marked a dramatic shift in the sisters' relationship. Elizabeth traveled slowly, genuinely ill with stress and possibly an infection. She arrived at Whitehall, dressed dramatically in white, the color of innocence, and asked immediately to see the Queen. Mary refused. Instead, Elizabeth was interrogated repeatedly by the council. She maintained her innocence with remarkable composure, but the evidence against her was mounting. A letter allegedly from her to Wyatt was produced, though she denied writing it. Several conspirators implicated her under torture, then recanted before execution. Mary faced an agonizing decision. Many counselors pressed for Elizabeth's execution, arguing she would always be a focal point for Protestant rebellion. The imperial ambassador reported that Mary had the warrant for Elizabeth's execution drawn up, and was keeping it by her half resolved in her mind. In the end, Mary couldn't sign it. Whether from genuine sisterly feeling or fear of public reaction, she stopped short of executing her half-sister. Instead, Elizabeth was sent to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had been imprisoned and executed 18 years earlier. Elizabeth's entry to the Tower on Palm Sunday 1554 was deliberately humiliating. Instead of using the private royal entrance, she was forced to enter through the Traitor's Gate, where the Thames water lapped at the stairs. Rain poured down as she sat on the cold stone steps, reportedly declaring, "Here landeth as true a subject being prisoner as ever landed at these stairs." The accommodations prepared for Elizabeth were the same rooms where Anne Boleyn had spent her final days. The psychological torture of this choice couldn't have been lost on Elizabeth. For 2 months, she lived in constant fear of execution, never knowing if each day would be her last. Tudor prison conditions, even for royal prisoners, were harsh. The tower was damp and cold, with stone walls that wept moisture in wet weather. Prisoners relied on servants or family to provide food, bedding, and other necessities. Elizabeth was allowed a few attendants, but her movements were severely restricted. During this time, Mary's Spanish marriage proceeded despite the widespread opposition. Philip arrived in England in July 1554, meeting his bride for the first time just days before their wedding. Mary, nearly 40 and never before married, fell deeply in love with her 27-year-old husband. Contemporary accounts describe her as rejuvenated by the marriage, dressing in youthful styles and dancing late into the night. By May 1554, Mary had decided that keeping Elizabeth in the Tower was too dangerous. Her popularity was growing as people sympathized with her plight. The Queen transferred her sister to Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, where she remained under house arrest. Her jailer, Sir Henry Bedingfield, maintained strict surveillance. Elizabeth was allowed to walk in the gardens, but never alone, and her correspondence was monitored. Life under house arrest had its own challenges. Elizabeth's household was severely restricted. Just a few trusted servants remained with her. Her movements were constantly watched. She had limited access to books and visitors. Yet she maintained her dignity and cultivated the loyalty of her small staff. To pass the long hours, Elizabeth read, when permitted, and worked on embroidery, a traditional feminine occupation that couldn't possibly seem threatening to her captives. She reportedly embroidered phrases in Latin and Greek into her needlework, demonstrating her learning, even in confinement. She also wrote poetry, including verses scratched with a diamond ring on a window pane at Woodstock. "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be." Quote, Elizabeth prisoner. Meanwhile, Mary's government proceeded with Catholic restoration. Parliament repealed all religious legislation passed under Henry VIII and Edward V. Cardinal Reginald Pole turned to England as Papal Legate, formally reconciling the country with Rome in November 1554. The heresy laws were revived, setting the stage for religious persecution. In early 1555, the burning of Protestant heretics began. First to die was John Rogers, followed by Bishop John Hooper, and eventually more prominent Protestant leaders, including Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. These executions horrified many English people, even those who supported Catholic restoration. The sight of men and women burning while still alive, sometimes taking up to half an hour to die, was sickening even by Tudor standards. Though high rank might protect her from such a public death, her Protestant faith put her in the same category as those dying at Smithfield. She attended Mass and outwardly conformed, but few believed her conversion genuine. By April 1555, Mary believed herself pregnant. The answer to her prayers for a Catholic succession. Overjoyed, she prepared for the birth expected in early summer. As her pregnancy progressed, pressure on Elizabeth eased. The birth of a child would push Elizabeth further from the throne, making her less of a threat. Mary relaxed the conditions of Elizabeth's confinement, eventually allowing her to return to court in April 1555. The sisters' reunion was cool, but correct. Elizabeth knelt before Mary, who raised her up and kissed her. Philippe, pragmatic despite his Catholicism, advocated for better treatment of Elizabeth. He recognized she remained popular with the English people. Court life continued with its elaborate rituals. Meals followed strict protocols with dozens of dishes presented in specific order. Entertainment included music, masks, and plays. Mary encouraged Spanish fashions, darker, more somber clothing than the colorful styles favored under Henry V. Elizabeth, it's always politically astute, adopted similarly conservative dress during this period. As Mary's pregnancy advanced, an odd problem emerged. There were no obvious signs of the child's movement. Her abdomen was swollen, but the expected quickening never came. May passed then, June, with no birth. By July, it became clear that Mary was experiencing a false pregnancy, possibly caused by an ovarian tumor or psychological factors. The pregnancy had lasted over a year when Mary finally accepted the truth. The humiliation was complete when her belly gradually deflated, leaving her devastated. Philip, who had remained in England, largely to await the birth of an heir, prepared to depart for his other territories. The Queen's dreams of a Catholic succession were shattered. With Mary's phantom pregnancy ended, and Philip departing England, Elizabeth's position improved dramatically. The Queen, though heartbroken, couldn't bring herself to take harsh measures against her sister without Philip's support. Elizabeth was allowed to retire to her own estates, where she gathered a household of loyal supporters and bided her time. By autumn 1555, Elizabeth had established herself at Hatfield House, maintaining a deliberate distance from court politics. She focused on creating an image of Protestant virtue, modest dress, serious study, and impeccable morals. She refused all discussion of marriage, though suitors continued to present themselves. The religious atmosphere in England grew increasingly tense as Mary's persecution of Protestants continued. Nearly 300 people would eventually die for their faith during her reign. These martyrdoms created powerful symbols for the Protestant cause. Fox's Book of Martyrs, published after Mary's death, would burn these stories into English consciousness for generations. For ordinary Tudor people, survival amid these religious shifts required careful navigation. Many practiced church papistry, outward conformity to official religion, while maintaining private beliefs. Others fled abroad, establishing Protestant communities in Geneva, Frankfurt, and other continental cities. Those who couldn't flee or conform faced terrible choices. Through all this turmoil, the basics of Tudor life continued. People rose with the sun and slept with its setting, following natural rhythms in an age before artificial lighting. They cooked over open fires, ate seasonal foods, and wore wool and linen clothes that required intensive labor to produce. They treated illness with herbs, prayer, and sometimes harmful practices like bloodletting. They lived with constant awareness of death from disease, childbirth, accident, or execution. Mary and Elizabeth, despite their royal status, lived within these same Tudor limitations. Their world lacked antibiotics, central heating, indoor plumbing, and reliable contraception. They faced the same fundamental vulnerability to disease and death as their subjects. The difference was in degree, not kind. They had better food, warmer clothes, and more spacious accommodation. But they couldn't escape their era's basic constraints. As 1555 turned to 1556, Elizabeth continued her careful balancing act. She maintained correspondence with Mary, expressing appropriate sisterly concern. She attended Mass when required. She avoided any hint of political involvement. But she also kept connections with Protestant sympathizers and prepared for the possibility that she might one day wear the crown. Mary, meanwhile, faced mounting problems. Her husband returned briefly, but soon departed again, this time for good. War with France drained the treasury. Harvest failures in 1555 and 1556 led to food shortages and inflation. Popular support for her reign waned as economic hardship combined with religious persecution. Her health declined steadily with debilitating headaches and abdominal pain. By 1557, it was clear that Mary's reign would not achieve her dream of permanent Catholic restoration. Without an heir, the succession would pass to Elizabeth, who would likely reverse her religious policies. The thought tormented Mary, but alternatives were limited. She briefly considered naming her Catholic cousin Margaret Douglas as heir, but ultimately recognized that the country would not accept anyone but Elizabeth. The relationship between the Tudor sisters had come full circle from Mary's early affection for baby Elizabeth through religious conflict, imprisonment, and now reluctant acceptance. Mary had tried to secure a Catholic future for England and failed. Elizabeth had survived the most dangerous period of her life through caution, intelligence, and sheer luck. As Mary's health deteriorated further in 1558, Elizabeth prepared quietly for her succession. She selected advisors, considered initial policies, and cultivated powerful allies. The princess, who had learned from childhood to hide her thoughts behind a pleasant mask, was about to step onto the greatest stage of all, the English throne. The autumn of 1555 brought chill winds and uncertainties to England. Queen Mary I, once so hopeful about her pregnancy, now faced the bitter reality that there would be no child. Her Spanish husband, Philippe, had departed for his continental territories, promising to return, but leaving Mary bereft and increasingly isolated. For Elizabeth, this shifting landscape offered both opportunity and danger. Life at Hatfield House, where Elizabeth maintained her separate establishment, had settled into a careful routine. The princess rose early for Protestant prayers, conducted privately with trusted ladies. Her mornings were dedicated to study. She continued to sharpen her formidable intellect through readings in history, theology, and languages. Afternoons might include writing when her health permitted, or needlework with her ladies. Evenings brought music, quiet conversation, and early retirement. This seemingly peaceful existence masked constant vigilance. Elizabeth's household was infiltrated with Mary's spies, reporting any hint of religious nonconformity or political plotting. The princess lived knowing that a careless word could mean a return to the Tower. She developed the ability to speak at length while saying nothing definitive, a skill that would serve her well as queen. "I have heard that an Italian, when asked how he planned to carry himself in England, replied cunningly and quietly," wrote William Seal, one of Elizabeth's advisors. The princess has chosen to follow this course. Indeed, Elizabeth mastered the art of ambiguity, attending Catholic Mass when necessary, but pleading illness when possible, expressing loyalty to Mary while maintaining connections with Protestant sympathizers. Mary's court offered stark contrast to Elizabeth's careful restraint. The Queen, trying to fill the void left by Philip's absence, threw herself into the religious restoration with increasing fervor. Her mornings began with lengthy Catholic devotions. Her days filled with council meetings focused on eliminating heresy. Mary personally reviewed the cases of prominent Protestants authorizing execution when they refused to recant. The mechanisms of Tudor punishment were designed to maximize both suffering and public spectacle. Burning was considered appropriate for heresy because it purified through fire. Executions took place in public squares with crowds forced to witness the terrible deaths. The condemned were chained to stakes surrounded by bundles of wood. If they were lucky, sympathetic executioners would hang bags of gunpowder around their necks to hasten death. Once the flames reached them, for ordinary Tudor people, these religious persecutions created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Neighbors reported neighbors for heretical statements. Possession of an English Bible could mean imprisonment. Failing to attend Mass brought fines. The religious police searched homes for forbidden Protestant books, often hidden under floorboards or inside walls. Food became another marker of religious conformity. The Catholic Restoration brought back traditional fasting days when meat was forbidden. Fish consumption was enforced not just as religious practice, but as economic policy. Mary's government, like her father's before her, recognized that a strong fishing fleet provided trained sailors for naval defense. Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday were designated fish days, with meat consumption on these days punishable by fine. Tudor meals followed strict class divisions. Noble tables featured exotic imports: oranges from Spain, sugar from the West Indies, spices from the East. Wealthy households consumed mountains of meat, beef, venison, lamb, and game birds like swan and peacock. The middling sort ate more modest portions of meat, along with bread, cheese, and seasonal vegetables. The poor subsisted primarily on pottage, a thick soup of vegetables and grains, occasionally enhanced with scraps of bacon. Cooking methods remained primitive by modern standards. Open hearth fires provided the only means of heating food. Spits for roasting required constant turning, a job usually assigned to the lowest kitchen servants, or even dogs trained to walk in a wheel. Baking occurred in brick ovens heated with wood fires that were rat out before bread went in. The control of temperature was more art than science, making consistent results challenging. Despite these limitations, Tudor cooks produced elaborate dishes for noble tables. They created magnificent subtleties, decorative sugar sculptures that depicted castles, ships, or biblical scenes. They fashioned elaborate pies with live birds concealed inside, ready to fly out when the crust was cut. They preserved fruits in honey or sugar, distilled flower waters for flavoring, and concocted medicinal cordials from herbs and alcohol. Maintaining health remained a constant struggle in Tudor England. Medical knowledge was a peculiar mix of practical herbalism, astrological theory, and religious belief. The body was thought to contain 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile that needed to remain in balance. Illness resulted from imbalance treated through diet, bloodletting, purging, or applications of herbal remedies. Mary's deteriorating health defied these treatments. Her symptoms, severe headaches, vision disturbances, and abdominal pain, worsened throughout 1556. In 1557, modern doctors suspect she suffered from ovarian cysts or uterine cancer. Conditions Tudor physicians couldn't diagnose or treat effectively. The Queen's physical suffering added to her increasingly melancholic outlook. Elizabeth, too, experienced health challenges during this period. She suffered from migraines, digestive complaints, and occasional severe illnesses that may have been influenza or other infections. Tudor medicine offered little effective relief. Even royal patients endured treatments that often made them worse: mercury for skin conditions, lead compounds for cosmetics, and powerful sedatives that caused dehydration. Hygiene practices, while better than commonly portrayed, remained basic. Both Mary and Elizabeth would have used linen cloths moistened with scented waters to clean their skin. They changed their linen undergarments daily, cleanliness indicated by fresh white cloth against the skin, rather than full-body bathing. Their outer garments of silk, velvet, and wool were rarely washed, but instead aired, brushed, and treated with herbs to discourage pests. The physical environment of Tudor royal residences combined grandeur and discomfort. Palaces featured magnificent great halls and presence chambers, but lacked basic amenities. Drafty corridors connected rooms heated inadequately by fireplaces. Windows, while increasingly made of glass rather than oiled cloth, provided minimal insulation against winter cold. Royal chambers were hung with tapestries and furnished with carpets, not just for decoration but for essential warmth. Sanitation remained primitive. Even royal residences used simple chamber pots emptied by servants or guard-robes, primitive toilets that emptied directly into cesspits or mows. The smell in densely populated areas became overwhelming, particularly in summer. Sewage-contaminated water supplies contributing to outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases. The wealthy, including Mary and Elizabeth, drank primarily ale, wine, or Hippocrates, spiced wine, rather than water. While Mary and Elizabeth occupied the pinnacle of Tudor society, they experienced the same environmental limitations as their subjects, though with better protection. Winter days were marked by chills, summer by insect bites. Neither queen nor princess could escape the realities of Tudor medicine, hygiene, or climate. The personal tension between the sisters intensified as Mary's reign progressed. In 1556, a new conspiracy emerged. The Dudley conspiracy, led by Henry Dudley, a relation of the executed Northumberland. Once again, investigations led to questions about Elizabeth's involvement. Though no direct evidence linked her to the plot, Mary's suspicions deepened. Each conspiracy reinforced Mary's conviction that Elizabeth represented an existential threat to Catholic restoration. Yet, she remained unwilling or unable to take the final step of executing her sister. This hesitation wasn't necessarily from sisterly affection. It's more likely practical recognition that Elizabeth's death might trigger rebellion. The princess had become a powerful symbol for those hoping for religious change. Philip's brief return to England in March 1557 temporarily improved relations between the sisters. The King of Spain, ever pragmatic, recognized Elizabeth's popularity and advised Mary to treat her with respect. During his visit, Elizabeth was invited to court and received with appropriate ceremony. Philip even arranged for Mary to provide Elizabeth with new clothing and jewels, enhancing her royal appearance. This thaw proved short-lived. Philip's real purpose in visiting England was to draw the country into his war with France. Mary eagerly agreed, desperate to please her husband and secure his longest stay. The decision proved disastrous. England lacked resources for a major continental conflict, and the war quickly drained the already depleted treasury. Worse followed in July 1557, when English forces joined Spanish troops in the Battle of St. Quentin. The Allied forces won, but England gained nothing from the victory. Philip returned to Spain, leaving Mary to manage the increasingly unpopular war. By January 1558, disaster struck. English forces lost Killala, the last English possession in France held since the 100 Red Years' War. The loss of Killala devastated English pride and Mary's reputation. "When I am dead and opened," the Queen reportedly said, "you shall find Killala lying in my heart." Public opinion turned sharply against the Spanish marriage that had brought war without benefit. Anti-Spanish sentiment grew, with people blaming foreign influence for England's troubles. Throughout these political upheavals, daily Tudor life continued with its seasonal rhythms. Spring brought relief from winter's hardships, but new agricultural demands. Summer meant intensive work in fields and gardens, preserving food for winter. Autumn brought harvest and slaughter time. Animals that couldn't be fed through winter were killed, and their meat preserved by salting or smoking. Winter meant indoor work by firelight, spinning, weaving, and repairing tools. These seasonal patterns affected even royal households. Court life followed its own calendar, with traditional celebrations marking the Christian year. The 12 days of Christmas brought elaborate feasting and entertainment. Lent imposed dietary restrictions even on royalty. Easter celebrated renewal with new clothes and special foods. Midsummer saw bonfires and outdoor revelry. For Mary and Elizabeth, these traditions carried both religious and political significance. Mary enthusiastically restored Catholic holy days eliminated under Edward, including elaborate processions for Corpus Christi. Elizabeth participated when required, but maintained Protestant skepticism about what she considered excessive ceremony. Housing conditions illustrated the vast gulf between royal and common experience. While Mary and Elizabeth occupied palaces with dozens of rooms, ordinary Tudor families might live in one or two rooms, often sharing space with livestock. A typical peasant house featured a single room with a central hearth. Dirt floor covered with rushes and minimal furniture, perhaps a table, benches, and a bed for the parents. Children and servants slept on straw pallets on the floor. Even for royalty, sleeping arrangements lacked privacy by modern standards. Mary and Elizabeth would have had bed attendants, trusted ladies who slept in the same chamber on trundle beds. These attendants provided both service and security, helping with nighttime needs and protecting against potential intruders. Complete solitude was rare for Tudor royalty. The beds themselves were important status symbols. Mary's state bed would have featured a wooden frame with embroidered hangings, feather mattress, linen sheets, and expensive coverlets. Elizabeth's bed, while not as grand as the Queen's, would still have represented significant value. Beds were often the most expensive items in Tudor households, frequently mentioned specifically in wills. Personal hygiene before sleep involved servants bringing heated water for washing hands and face. Hair was brushed and braided, teeth cleaned with linen cloths and powder made from herbs or chalk. Women wore linen nightgowns, men linen nightshirts. The ceremony of preparing royal bodies for sleep followed careful protocols, with specific servants assigned to each task. As 1558 progressed, Mary's health declined precipitously. The Queen, who had once been described as never having a day's illness, now suffered constantly. Her abdomen swelled, her headaches intensified, her vision blurred. Modern doctors suspect advanced ovarian or uterine cancer, explaining both her symptoms and her false pregnancy. Tudor physicians could offer only palliatives, herbal teas, warm compresses, and opium for severe pain. In August 1558, an influenza epidemic swept England, further weakening the already ill Queen. By October, it was clear that Mary was dying. Reluctantly, she recognized the inevitable. Elizabeth would succeed her. The Queen sent her sister the royal jewels as a gesture of reconciliation and acknowledgement of the succession. Elizabeth, still at Hatfield, prepared carefully for what seemed imminent, her accession to the throne. She selected key advisors, including William Seal, who would become her principal secretary. She drafted initial proclamations and considered immediate priorities, yet she maintained careful distance from any appearance of eagerness for her sister's death. The religious persecution that had darkened Mary's reign slowed as the Queen weakened. The burning of Protestants had created martyrs rather than converting heretics. Nearly 300 people had died, but Protestantism had grown stronger rather than weaker. The public increasingly viewed the burnings with horror rather than approval. Mary's final weeks brought physical agony and spiritual preparation. As a devout Catholic, she focused on confession, communion, and extreme unction, the last rites of the Church. She made her will requesting burial beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon. She expressed regret for failures, but maintained conviction that her religious policies had been necessary and right. For Elizabeth, these final weeks brought both anticipation and danger. Until Mary actually died, the princess remained vulnerable to last-minute changes in the succession, or even arrest. She maintained strict control over her household, allowing no premature celebration or political activity that might be reported to Mary's council. Tudor deathbeds were rarely private affairs. As Mary weakened, her chamber filled with counselors, ladies, and priests. The watching and waiting had practical purpose. Royal deaths needed reliable witnesses to prevent rumors of foul play and ensure smooth succession. The Queen's suffering was observed and recorded by dozens of eyes. The physical process of dying in Tudor England lacked modern medical interventions. Pain management relied primarily on alcohol, opium derivatives, or herbal preparations of dubious efficacy. Dehydration and infection often hastened death. The smell of illness permeated sick rooms. Bodily functions failed, wounds festered, and herbal remedies created their own pungent odor. Throughout October and early November, couriers rode constantly between London and Hatfield, bringing Elizabeth updates on Mary's condition. The princess responded with appropriate expressions of concern while quietly finalizing succession plans. She wrote to potential allies, secured promises of support, and prepared for the massive transition of power. Mary's council, recognizing the inevitable, began shifting allegiance toward Elizabeth. Even staunch Catholics like Nicholas Heath, Archbishop of York, accepted that Mary's death would mean Protestant restoration. Some counselors tried to secure promises from Elizabeth about religious toleration, but she remained non-committal, a pattern that would characterize her early reign. On November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor died at St. James's Palace. She was 42 years old and had reigned for just over 5 years. Within hours, bells rang throughout London, announcing her death and Elizabeth's succession. The Privy Council proclaimed the new queen, and messengers rode to Hatfield with the news. Elizabeth, sitting under an oak tree in the park at Hatfield when the news arrived, reportedly quoted Psalm 118, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." After years of danger, captivity, and careful dissimulation, she had survived to claim her inheritance. The princess, who had never been expected to rule, had become Queen Elizabeth I for ordinary Tudor people. The transition from Mary to Elizabeth represented yet another religious and political shift to navigate. Those who had conformed outwardly to Catholicism while maintaining Protestant sympathies could emerge from hiding. Those who had embraced Catholic restoration now faced uncertain futures. The pendulum of Tudor religious policy was swinging again. The contrast between the sisters' reigns would prove stark. Mary's 5 years brought religious persecution, war, economic hardship, and loss of territory. Elizabeth's 45-year reign would eventually bring religious settlement, cultural flowering, naval triumph, and national pride. Yet, the seeds of Elizabeth's success were partly sown by Mary's failures. The younger sister learned crucial lessons from the Elorses' mistakes. Mary's funeral on December 14, 1558 took place according to full Catholic rites, the last such royal ceremony in England for centuries. Elizabeth did not attend, following custom that monarchs did not appear at funerals. The new queen ordered appropriate ceremony, but without excessive expense. The treasury was nearly empty after Mary's wars. The sisters, who had shared so much royal blood, dangerous childhoods, and the unprecedented challenge of female rule in a male-dominated world, were now separated by death. Their relationship had encompassed affection and antagonism, loyalty and suspicion, shared heritage and opposing faiths. Together, they had demonstrated that women could rule England in their own right, forever changing assumptions about female sovereignty. As 1558 drew to a close, Elizabeth prepared for her coronation, scheduled for January 15, 1559. The 25-year-old queen, who had survived extraordinary dangers to reach the throne, would face new challenges. A divided nation, empty treasury, foreign threats, and the fundamental question of whether a woman could effectively rule alone. The princess had become a queen, but the challenges of Tudor survival continued. The winter of 1558 arrived with bitter winds and transformative change. Queen Mary was dead. Elizabeth Tudor, at 25, had ascended to the throne her sister had occupied for 5 troubled years. The half-sisters, once bound by blood and separated by faith, would never meet again in this world. Yet Mary's shadow would linger over Elizabeth's early reign, providing both warning and guidance as the new queen charted her course. Elizabeth's coronation procession on January 14, 1559 offered stark contrast to Mary's final months, where the late queen had grown increasingly isolated. Elizabeth rode through London streets packed with cheering crowds where Mary had intensified religious persecution. Elizabeth stopped to receive a Bible from the city officials, kissing it and holding it to her heart. A carefully choreographed gesture signaling religious change without explicitly promising Protestant restoration. "I have long desired to see this day," one Londoner was heard saying as the new queen passed, "no more burning for religion's sake." The public mood reflected exhaustion with Mary's religious policies and hope for Elizabeth's more moderate approach. Yet the religious divisions Mary had tried to heal through force remained raw and dangerous. The practicalities of Tudor royal transition were complex. Elizabeth inherited Mary's ladies-in-waiting, but gradually replaced Catholics with Protestants. She kept some of Mary's counselors, while introducing her own trusted advisors. William Seal, her choice for principal secretary, had served her brother Edward and maintained quiet contact during Mary's reign. Robert Dudley, son of the executed Duke of Northumberland, became Master of the Horse, a position keeping him close to the Queen. Elizabeth's daily routine established patterns that would continue throughout her reign and began with brief Protestant prayers. After a light breakfast, she spent mornings on state papers, reading dispatches and writing responses with her own hand rather than dictating to secretaries. Midday brought the formal dinner served with ceremony, but less elaborate than under Mary. Afternoons included council meetings, audiences, and occasional recreation, music, dancing, or riding. This disciplined schedule contrasted with Mary's later years when illness had disrupted regular government business. Elizabeth's energy impressed foreign ambassadors, one reporting, "She never sits still for an hour together, but is always either walking or talking with someone or working at something with her own hands." This calculated display of vigor reassured a nation accustomed to sickly monarchs. Edward's short life, Mary's decline, that Elizabeth might provide stability. The new queen inherited practical problems beyond religion. The treasury stood nearly empty after Mary's war with France. The harvest of 1558 had been poor, raising food prices, cloth exports. England's economic mainstay had declined. Coinage had been debased under Henry VIII and Edward VI, causing inflation. The loss of Kala damaged national pride and trade connections. These economic challenges affected daily life throughout England. For ordinary people, rising prices meant hunger and hardship. Bread, the staple food for all classes, became more expensive as grain prices increased. Meat, already a luxury for the poor, grew further out of reach. In London, food riots threatened when prices spiked. The contrast between royal abundance and common hunger remained stark. Elizabeth's coronation feast featured elaborate dishes. Peacocks redressed in their feathers, sugar sculptures depicting biblical scenes, spiced wine flowing freely. Meanwhile, beggars gathered at palace gates hoping for leftover scraps. Tudor society accepted such inequality as natural, though the wise monarch showed concern for the poor. Elizabeth cultivated an image of caring while maintaining royal splendor. Housing conditions reflected similar divides. Elizabeth occupied palaces with hundreds of rooms rotating between Whitehall, Greenwich, Hampton Court, and other royal residences. Ordinary Londoners crowded into single rooms and tenements, often sharing beds with strangers. Rural cottages lived in simple one- or two-room structures, with dirt floors and thatched roofs prone to vermin infestation. Even for the Queen, Tudor palace life lacked modern comforts. Drafty corridors connected unevenly heated chambers. Windows, though increasingly glazed rather than covered with oiled cloth, provided minimal insulation. Sanitation remained primitive. Chamber pots emptied by servants into cesspits or directly into rivers. The Thames receiving London's waste became so polluted that its stench was notorious, especially in summer. Elizabeth addressed these physical discomforts with practical adaptations. Her chambers were hung with tapestries for insulation as well as decoration. Fires burned constantly in winter, consuming vast quantities of wood. Her personal hygiene, by Tudor standards, was exemplary. She changed linen undergarments daily and was known for relatively frequent bathing, sometimes monthly rather than the quarterly baths common among nobility. "I wish to make myself comfortable," Elizabeth told her household officers, establishing a more relaxed atmosphere than Mary's formal Spanish-influenced court. The new queen encouraged music, dancing, and theatrical performances. She maintained some Catholic ladies in her household but no longer required attendance at Mass. This practical tolerance reflected political necessity rather than indifference. Elizabeth needed to reconcile a divided nation. religious settlement became Elizabeth's first major challenge. Parliament convened in January 1559 to address church governance. After contentious debate, the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity established moderate Protestantism as England's official religion. Elizabeth became supreme governor of the church, not supreme head, a title her father had used. A new prayer book provided English services with deliberately ambiguous language on controversial theological points. This Elizabethan settlement disappointed zealots on both sides. Strict Protestants wanted more thorough reformation, eliminating vestments and ceremonies they considered papist. Catholics felt betrayed by Mary's sister, returning England to heresy. Elizabeth's famous desire not to make windows into men's souls, reflected, and pragmatic recognition that forced conversion had failed under both Edward and Mary. For ordinary people, religious change affected daily rhythms. Church attendance became mandatory with fines for absence. The church calendar simplified, eliminating many saints' days that had punctuated the medieval year. Church interiors transformed again. Altars removed, walls whitewashed, religious images taken down. Parish priests struggled to implement changes while maintaining community harmony. Food practices shifted with religious policy. The strict Catholic fast days of Mary's reign, when meat was forbidden, became less stringent. Elizabeth maintained some fish days for economic rather than religious reasons, supporting the fishing industry that provided sailors for naval defense. The Queen's personal diet was notably moderate. She ate sparingly compared to her father's legendary appetite, preferring poultry, vegetables, and sweet foods to heavy meat dishes. Health concerns remained constant across reigns, the same diseases that had plagued Mary's England. Smallpox, sweating, sickness, influenza, dysentery continued under Elizabeth. Medical knowledge remained limited, combining herbal remedies, bloodletting, and increasing use of mineral compounds, often toxic by modern standards. The Queen employed multiple physicians, but reportedly preferred simple treatments to extreme interventions. Elizabeth's personal health proved surprisingly robust compared to her siblings. Where Edward had died young and Mary suffered chronic illness, Elizabeth generally maintained good health despite occasional serious illnesses. She survived smallpox in 1562 and several influenza outbreaks. Her physical resilience matched her political durability, though, like all Tudor women, she faced gender-specific health challenges without effective medical support. The Queen's day-to-day management of bodily needs reflected Tudor practicalities. Her private chambers included a close stool, a box containing a chamber pot, sometimes padded and covered in rich fabric for royal comfort. Personal hygiene involved linen cloths for cleaning, herb-scented waters for refreshing skin, and tooth cleaning with cloths and powder. Her famous white makeup containing lead compounds, harmful by modern standards, covered smallpox scars while creating the iconic mask of youth she maintained into old age. Clothing served both practical and symbolic functions in Tudor England. Elizabeth's wardrobe became increasingly elaborate as her reign progressed, eventually including nearly 2,000 gowns. This extravagance wasn't mere vanity. Her appearance represented England's prosperity and her own authority. Each outfit incorporated symbolic elements: embroidered eyes and ears indicating her awareness of court intrigues, celestial motifs suggesting divine approval. Beneath the symbolic surface, Tudor clothing served basic needs. Multiple layers provided warmth in drafty palaces. Linen undergarments absorbed body oils and could be washed frequently, while outer garments of silk, velvet, and wool were spot-cleaned and aired rather than fully laundered. Both men and women wore stockings for warmth, with the wealthy using silk, while commoners wore wool. Shoes had thin leather soles that provided minimal protection from cold or wet. Even the Queen would have experienced damp feet on rainy days. Sleep patterns reflected natural rhythms in an age before artificial lighting, though state business sometimes kept her working later by candlelight. Tudor people generally slept in two segments, falling asleep soon after dark, waking for an hour or two around midnight. This first sleep and second sleep pattern appears in contemporary accounts, with the midnight waking period used for prayer, quiet conversation, or contemplation. The Queen never slept alone. Trusted ladies always attended her bedchamber, sleeping nearby on trundle beds. This arrangement provided both service and security, allowing immediate assistance for nighttime needs while protecting against potential intruders. Elizabeth's bed itself represented significant value. Royal beds featured carved frames, embroidered hangings, feather mattresses, fine linen sheets, altogether worth more than many Tudor households' entire possessions. As Elizabeth established her reign patterns, memories of Mary's failure to secure Catholic succession faded. The new queen faced constant pressure to marry and produce heirs. But Mary's experience offered cautionary lessons. The elder sister's desperate desire for a child had led to humiliating false pregnancy and increased dependence on an absent husband. Elizabeth, observing these pitfalls, moved cautiously regarding marriage proposals. "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England," Elizabeth declared. Though she entertained numerous suitors and maintained the possibility of marriage for diplomatic advantage, this strategic ambiguity, keeping options open without commitment, characterized her early reign, preventing any faction from gaining advantage through matrimonial alliance. Daily life for ordinary Tudor people continued its seasonal rhythms, regardless of who wore the crown. Spring brought planting and cleaning after winter's confinement. Summer meant intensive agricultural labor from dawn to dusk. Autumn brought harvest and food preservation, smoking meat, brewing ale, storing root vegetables in cool cellars. Winter meant indoor work by firelight, spinning, weaving, repairing tools, and long evenings of storytelling to pass dark hours. Food availability followed these seasonal patterns. Spring brought hunger months, when winter stores dwindled before new crops matured. Summer offered fresh vegetables and fruits, but required preservation for winter use. Autumn brought abundance, freshly slaughtered meat, newly harvested grain, apples and pears for cider and perry. Winter relied on preserved foods, salted meat, dried fruit, stored grain, and root vegetables in sand-filled barrels. Class differences remained starkly visible in food consumption. Elizabeth's court consumed large quantities of meat. Records show courtiers ate up to 2 pounds of meat daily, supplemented with bread, wine, and seasonal produce. Prosperous farmers and merchants ate meat several times weekly, with bread, cheese, and vegetables forming dietary staples. The poor subsisted primarily on bread and pottage, vegetable soup, with meat appearing rarely on their tables. Ale and beer provided both nutrition and safe hydration for all classes. Water sources were frequently contaminated, particularly in London, where the Thames served as both water supply and sewage disposal. Weak ale, brewed at home by housewives, offered safer hydration with minimal alcohol content. The Queen preferred wine, often sweetened and spiced in the Hippocratic style. Though she was noted for moderate consumption compared to her father's legendary drinking, cooking methods remained primitive by modern standards. Most households cooked over open hearth fires, with wealthier homes featuring brick ovens for baking. Food preparation required constant attention, turning spits manually, stirring pots to prevent burning, maintaining proper fire temperature without thermostats. Even royal kitchens relied on skilled judgment rather than precise measurements, with recipes listing ingredients but rarely specifying exact quantities. The contrast between Elizabeth's early reign and Mary's final years extended beyond religion and politics to court atmosphere, where Mary had grown increasingly somber. Elizabeth cultivated a lively court with music, dancing, and theatrical performances. The new queen's love of pageantry manifested in elaborate court entertainments, where allegorical figures praised her virtues and celebrated England's as promise under virgin rule. This carefully crafted image, the Virgin Queen dedicated to her country, developed gradually as Elizabeth rejected successive marriage proposals. The symbolism served multiple purposes, transforming a potential weakness, childlessness, into strength, undivided devotion to England. It also avoided Mary's mistake of marrying a foreign prince whose loyalty lay elsewhere, alienating English subjects jealous of their independence. Elizabeth's religious settlement avoided Mary's fatal error of prioritizing doctrinal purity over practical governance. Where Mary had seen heresy as souls to be saved through force if necessary, Elizabeth focused on outward conformity while permitting private belief to remain largely unexamined. Her famous statement that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls reflected pragmatic recognition that forced conversion had failed under both Edward and Mary. The new Queen's administration addressed practical problems Mary had neglected while pursuing religious goals. Elizabeth's government reformed currency, restoring confidence in coinage. Her ministers negotiated peace with France, ending the costly war Mary had entered to please Philip. Her council encouraged cloth exports, reviving trade damaged by religious conflict. These practical measures improved daily life for ordinary people, building popular support that Mary had squandered. Housing conditions for most Tudor people remained basic regardless of religious policy. The majority lived in timber-framed structures with well and door walls, wooden frames filled with mud, straw, and animal dung. Roofs were typically thatched, though fire regulations in London increasingly required tile. Floors were packed earth covered with rushes that absorbed spills and debris, replaced periodically when they became too foul. Windows, if present, were small and often covered with oiled cloth rather than expensive glass. Even within these simple dwellings, class distinctions manifested. A prosperous farmer might have a two-room house with separate spaces for cooking, eating, and sleeping. A laborer might share a single room with family and perhaps livestock. Urban workers often rented portions of subdivided buildings with multiple families sharing minimal space. The contrast with royal palaces containing hundreds of rooms highlighted Tudor England's extreme inequality. Personal cleanliness reflected similar disparities. Elizabeth maintained relatively high standards with regular hand and face washing, weekly foot bathing, and occasional full immersion. Ordinary people washed hands and faces daily, but bathed bodies less frequently, perhaps monthly, for the middling sort seasonally, for laborers. Clean linen undergarments indicated respectable status, while outer garments were spot-cleaned rather than fully washed. The environment itself presented health challenges. London's air quality suffered from thousands of coal fires, creating smog that contemporary accounts described as thick enough to taste. The Thames receiving the city's waste became increasingly polluted. Streets accumulated garbage despite regulations requiring householders to clean their frontage. Rural areas offered cleaner air, but featured manure piles, slaughter waste, and inadequate sanitation. Disease remained a constant threat across social boundaries. Same infections that could kill commoners also endangered royalty. Elizabeth's survival of smallpox in 1562 demonstrated that wealth provided limited protection against Tudor England's microbial threats. The Queen's recovery was attributed to her physician's treatments, divine favor, and her own constitution. Though modern medicine would recognize that survival depended primarily on immune response rather than ineffective remedies. As Elizabeth's reign stabilized, Mary's memory began fading from public consciousness. The new queen made no direct criticism of her sister, but allowed Mary's reputation to diminish through neglect rather than active destruction. Official histories emphasized Elizabeth's legitimacy, while quietly obscuring Mary's precedent as England's first undisputed queen regnant. Court paintings and propaganda focused on Elizabeth's direct connection to Henry VIII, bypassing the intervening reigns. Yet privately, Elizabeth may have maintained more complex feelings about her half-sister. She preserved some of Mary's personal possessions, including prayer books and jewelry. She retained certain Spanish customs Mary had introduced at court, including formalizing meal service. Most significantly, she never married, a decision influenced by multiple factors. But perhaps partly by observing Mary's marital disappointments, Mary's ghost in Elizabeth's reign appeared most visibly in religious policy. The new queen avoided her sister's fatal error of religious persecution, establishing moderate Protestantism that required outward conformity while permitting private conscience some freedom. Catholics faced increasing restrictions and occasional persecution as Elizabeth's reign progressed, but nothing approaching the wholesale burning of heretics that had characterized Mary's rule. The Queen's personal devotional practices reflected this moderation. Elizabeth maintained a private chapel with modest Protestant ceremony, English prayers, simple communion service, and limited religious imagery. She rejected both Catholic elaboration and Puritan austerity, maintaining middle ground that accommodated the majority, while frustrating zealots on both extremes. This pragmatic approach contrasted with Mary's doctrinaire Catholicism, which had alienated moderate subjects. Daily governance under Elizabeth addressed practical concerns Mary had often neglected. The new queen maintained regular council meetings, reviewed state papers personally, and engaged directly with administrative details. This hands-on approach contrasted with Mary's later years, when illness had limited her. Participation in government and Philip's influence had complicated decision-making. For ordinary Tudor people, Elizabeth's early reign brought cautious optimism after Mary's troubled final years. The harvest of 1559 proved better than the previous year's easing food prices. Peace with France reduced taxes needed for warfare. Religious moderation allowed communities to adapt gradually, rather than facing sudden transformation. The young queen's vigor suggested stability after 3 successive monarchs with health problems. Elizabeth cultivated this image of energetic leadership through public appearances. Unlike Mary, who had become increasingly reclusive as health failed, Elizabeth undertook regular progresses through the countryside, staying at noble houses, and allowing ordinary people to see their queen. These journeys served political purposes, displaying royal authority, monitoring local conditions, and preventing any faction from dominating court while building personal connection between monarch and subjects. The contrast between the sisters' approaches to queenship became increasingly apparent as Elizabeth's reign progressed. Where Mary had emphasized royal majesty through Spanish-influenced formality, Elizabeth balanced dignity with accessibility. Where Mary had maintained strict religious observance, Elizabeth moderated ceremonial requirements. Where Mary had focused on doctrinal purity, sometimes at the expense of effective governance, Elizabeth prioritized practical solutions over ideological consistency. These differences reflected not just personality, but experience. Mary had reached the throne at 37, after years of religious persecution and political marginalization. Her reign represented her one opportunity to restore what she considered true faith. Elizabeth became queen at 25 after surviving extraordinary dangers through caution and adaptability. Her reign offered a chance to secure Protestant settlement through incremental change rather than dramatic transformation. By the early 1560s, Elizabeth had established patterns that would characterize her entire 45-year reign. She maintained religious moderation despite pressure from Protestant reformers for more thorough change. She entertained marriage proposals without commitment. She balanced factional interests rather than allowing any group to dominate policy. She displayed personal glamour while maintaining administrative efficiency. Mary's shadow gradually receded as Elizabeth's accomplishments accumulated. The elder sister's 5 troubled years came to seem brief interruption rather than significant reign. The younger sister's longevity. Elizabeth would eventually rule longer than her father, brother, and sister combined. Amaminte allowed her to reshape English memory, establishing herself as the dominant Tudor monarch in popular imagination. Yet the sisters remained linked by blood, experience, and historical significance. Together, they demonstrated that women could rule in their own right, challenging assumptions about female capacity for sovereignty. They navigated the unprecedented challenges of queenship in a society structured around male authority. They established precedents that would influence later female monarchs from Mary II to Victoria to Elizabeth. 2. As Elizabeth's reign continued into the 1560s, Mary's legacy survived primarily as cautionary example. The younger sister avoided the elder's mistakes. Religious extremism, Spanish marriage, neglect of practical governance while building on foundations Mary had helped establish. The Catholic queen had demonstrated that a woman could claim the throne successfully, despite opposition. The Protestant queen would show that a woman could rule effectively without male partnership. The sisters who had shared Tudor blood but opposed 2 divisions would eventually share burial space in Westminster Abbey. Mary's final wish to be buried beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, remained unfulfilled. Instead, she rested in the Lady Chapel until Elizabeth's death in 6003, when James F. ordered construction of a magnificent tomb containing both queens. The inscription partners and throne engrave, "Here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection, united in death." The women whose lives had diverged so dramatically. For ordinary Tudor people, the reigns of Mary and Elizabeth demonstrated the profound impact individual monarchs could have on daily existence. Religious policy determined worship practices, fast days, church decoration, and community rituals. Foreign relations affected trade, taxation, and security. Court patronage influenced cultural production. What books were printed? What plays performed? What music composed? The sisters' different approaches shaped not just high politics, but everyday experience throughout England. As Elizabeth's reign continued its steady course, Mary's troubled rule faded into a historical footnote rather than living memory. The elder sister's dreams of Catholic restoration dissolved as Protestant settlement took root. The younger sister's pragmatic policies built national confidence and cultural flourishing. Yet without Mary's precedent, proving a woman could claim the crown despite opposition, Elizabeth's reign might never have begun. The early morning light filtered through the window coverings. At St. James's Palace on November 17, 1558, inside the royal bedchamber, Queen Mary Tudor lay dying. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. The room smelled of sickness, medicinal herbs, and the heavy incense used in Catholic last rites. Counselors, ladies-in-waiting, and priests hovered nearby, watching as England's first undisputed queen slipped away. Miles away at Hatfield House, Elizabeth Tudor waited. For weeks, messengers had brought reports of her sister's declining health. The 25-year-old princess maintained careful composure, showing neither eagerness nor grief. She had survived too much. Her mother's execution, her father's rejection, her brother's death, and her sister's suspicion to make a misstep now with the crown almost within reach. Mary died peacefully around noon, having received the Catholic sacraments. She had fought to restore to England. Within hours, bells rang throughout London. First, the solemn death knell for the departed queen, then joyful peals announcing Elizabeth's succession. The Tudor succession, which had caused so much turmoil, had passed smoothly at last. England had a new queen. When the news reached Hatfield, Elizabeth was reportedly sitting under an oak tree in the park. According to tradition, she fell to her knees, quoted Psalm 118 in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Then rose as Queen Elizabeth I of England. The cautious princess had become a sovereign ruler. Her first words as queen demonstrated political shrewdness. To William Seal, who would become her principal secretary, she said, "I observe all men's characters and remember them." This quiet warning served notice that Elizabeth had watched and remembered, who had supported her during Mary's reign and who had not. Unlike her sister, who had been largely isolated from politics until her accession, Elizabeth had spent years preparing for rule. The physical contrast between the sisters' situations at similar moments proved striking. Mary had come to the throne at 37, already showing signs of the health problems that would plague her reign. Elizabeth ascended at 25, vigorous and sharp-minded. Mary had inherited a country tentatively Protestant after Edward's reforms. Elizabeth received a nation uncertainly Catholic after Mary's restoration. Both faced religious division, but Elizabeth had observed her sister's mistakes. The new queen's first weeks demonstrated her understanding of symbolic politics. She retained some of Mary's Catholic counselors. While introducing trusted Protestants like Seal, she attended Mass but forbade the elevation of the host, a compromise pleasing neither extreme but acceptable to moderates. She dressed richly but modestly, creating visual contrast with Mary's Spanish-influenced formality. Elizabeth moved immediately to establish her authority. She summoned Parliament for January 1559, allowing time to prepare religious settlement. She appointed commissioners to review Mary's financial records, seeking ways to repair the treasury depleted by Spanish War. She began interviewing potential ambassadors, recognizing England's precarious international position between Catholic France and Spain. Mary's funeral on December 14, 1558 provided Elizabeth's opportunity for magnanimity without personal appearance. Following royal tradition, the new monarch did not attend her predecessor's burial. Elizabeth ordered appropriate ceremony, though without excessive expense given the empty treasury. Mary received Catholic rites, the last royal funeral conducted according to Roman practice in England for centuries. Despite Elizabeth's absence, the funeral illustrated the sisters' complex relationship. Mary was buried not beside her mother as she had wished, but in Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel. Her grave remained unmarked until Elizabeth's death in 6003, when their successor, James Thor, ordered a magnificent shared monument. The inscription in Latin read "Partners in throne in grave." Here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary's sisters in hope of resurrection. Elizabeth's coronation on January 15, 59 offered deliberate contrast to Mary's 5 years earlier, where Mary had emphasized Catholic continuity. Elizabeth balanced traditional ceremony with Protestant simplicity. She processed through London streets to enthusiastic crowds, a stark change from the subdued response to Mary's Spanish marriage. Even the weather cooperated, providing January sunshine after Mary's rainy coronation. The new queen established daily routines that would continue throughout her 45-year reign began with prayer and light breakfast. Mornings involved reading dispatches and writing responses in her own distinctive handwriting. Midday brought formal dinner with courtiers, followed by afternoon business, council meetings, ambassadorial audiences, and document signing. Evenings featured entertainment, music, dancing, and theatrical performances before a light supper and retirement. This disciplined schedule differed from Mary's later years when illness had disrupted regular government. Elizabeth maintained consistent administration even during progress. Traveling the countryside, staying at noble homes, or occasional illness, her working habits impressed foreign observers. The Venetian ambassador reported she never sits still and reads more than any other woman of her age. Elizabeth's coronation portrait depicted her in rich robes with unbound hair, symbolizing both royal majesty and virginal purity. This carefully constructed image developed over time into the cult of the Virgin Queen, transforming potential weakness, doubtlessness, into political strength, undivided devotion to England. The contrast with Mary's desperate pursuit of pregnancy underscored different approaches to female rulership. The new queen addressed religious division through Parliament's 1559 religious settlement. The Act of Supremacy established Elizabeth as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a slightly modified version of her father's title, Supreme Head, acknowledging gender while maintaining royal authority. The Act of Uniformity imposed a revised Book of Common Prayer, creating moderately Protestant services without extreme Reformation theology. This settlement, sometimes called the Elizabethan Compromise, reflected lessons learned from Mary's reign, where Mary had attempted to reimpose Catholicism through force, creating Protestant martyrs. Elizabeth required outward conformity while permitting private conscience and freedom. Her famous statement about not making windows into men's souls contrasted sharply with Mary S's insistence on genuine conversion. For ordinary Tudor people, religious change affected daily rhythms. Church attendance became mandatory, with 12-penny fines for absence. Parish churches underwent another transformation. Altars removed, walls whitewashed, religious images taken down. The church calendar simplified, eliminating many saints' days that had structured the medieval year. These changes completed the process begun under Edward V's VI, but reversed by Mary. Beyond religion, Elizabeth addressed practical problems Mary had neglected. The new government reformed currency, restoring confidence in coinage debased under Henry VIII and Edward V. VI. Peace negotiations with France ended the costly war Mary had entered to please Philippe, allowing commercial recovery. Trade policies encouraged cloth exports, England's economic mainstay. These measures gradually improved daily life for ordinary people. Elizabeth's pragmatic approach extended to court atmosphere while maintaining necessary royal dignity. She created less formal environment than Mary's Spanish-influenced rigidity. She encouraged English music rather than continental styles, preferred English idioms to Latin or French phrases, and developed distinctly English court entertainment. This cultural nationalism contrasted with Mary's internationalist Catholic outlook. For royal servants, the transition between reigns brought practical challenges. The royal household numbered hundreds, gentlemen and ladies of the chamber, clerks, cooks, grooms, gardeners, and guards. Many transferred from Mary's service to Elizabeth's, adapting to different religious requirements and personal preferences. The physical business of moving royal possessions between palaces continued its seasonal pattern, regardless of which sister wore the crown. Daily life, for ordinary Tudor people, showed more continuity than change across reigns. Peasant farmers still rose at dawn to work fields with techniques unchanged for centuries. Urban craftsmen still practiced trades organized through guilds. Housewives still spent hours producing food, cloth, and medicine for family use. The rhythm of seasonal labor, planting, harvesting, preserving, continued regardless of religious policy or international relations. Material conditions remained basic by modern standards. Most Tudor homes featured a central hearth with smoke escaping through roof holes rather than proper chimneys. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a table, benches, storage chest, and bed for the parents with children sleeping on floor pallets. Kitchen equipment consisted of iron pots, wooden utensils, and simple tools. Artificial light came from tallow candles, or rushlights, making winter evenings dark and inactive for all but the wealthy. Food patterns reflected similar stability within seasonal variation. Bread remained the staple for all classes, consuming about half a family's food budget. Pottage, vegetable soup thickened with oats or barley, provided daily sustenance for working people. Meat appeared on ordinary tables more frequently than in earlier centuries, but remained occasional rather than daily for the lower classes. Beer and ale provided safe hydration when water sources were questionable. Class differences manifested dramatically in diet. Elizabeth's court consumed vast quantities of meat. Records suggest courtiers ate up to 2 pounds daily, with dozens of options at formal meals. Prosperous farmers and merchants enjoyed meat several times weekly. Supplemented with dairy products and homegrown vegetables, the poor subsisted primarily on bread, peas, beans, and seasonal greens, with meat appearing mainly at festivals. Cooking methods remained primitive by modern standards. Most households prepared food over open hearth fires using iron pots, spits, and griddles. Baking occurred in communal village ovens or larger homes. Brick ovens heated with wood fires rat out before bread went in. Food preservation relied on techniques developed over centuries: salting, smoking, pickling, and drying, without understanding the bacterial processes involved. Health challenges remained constant across reigns. The same diseases that had plagued Mary's England, smallpox, influenza, dysentery, malaria, called O, and tuberculosis, continued under Elizabeth. Medical knowledge combined traditional herbalism, classical humoral theory, and emerging but limited empirical observation. Treatments ranged from helpful willow bark, containing aspirin-like compounds for fever, to harmful mercury for syphilis, to neutral most herbal preparations. She employed multiple physicians, but reportedly preferred simple treatments to extreme interventions. When she contracted smallpox in 1562, her doctors prescribed traditional remedies, but her survival likely resulted from natural immunity rather than ineffective medicines. The Queen's recovery from this life-threatening illness reinforced her image of divine protection. Personal hygiene practices continued patterns established for centuries. Daily washing focused on hands and face, using basins of water brought by servants. Full immersion bathing remained occasional, though Elizabeth reportedly bathed more frequently than many contemporaries, perhaps monthly rather than quarterly. Clean linen undergarments indicated respectable status, while outer garments received spot cleaning rather than full laundering. The Queen's famous white makeup containing white lead compounds, harmful by modern standards, served both cosmetic and symbolic purposes. It covered smallpox scars while creating the iconic mask of youth maintained into old age. This carefully constructed appearance symbolized consistency and stability. The unchanging Virgin Queen dedicated to her country while masking the physical aging process. Mary's reign had demonstrated the challenges facing female monarchy in a patriarchal society. Many had questioned whether a woman could rule effectively without male partnership. Elizabeth addressed these concerns through carefully crafted symbolism, presenting herself as both female and exceptional with virgin purity, enabling masculine authority, where Mary had embraced traditional femininity despite royal status. Elizabeth created unique gender presentation combining feminine appearance with masculine rhetoric. This strategic self-presentation appeared in Elizabeth's speeches, particularly the famous Tilbury speech during the Spanish Armada crisis. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Such language acknowledged gender constraints while transcending them, offering Tudor minds acceptable framework for female rule. Mary had never found similar resolution to the fundamental contradiction of queenship in a male-dominated world. Elizabeth avoided Mary's fatal mistake of foreign marriage, which had surrendered partial sovereignty to Spanish interests. The new queen entertained numerous suitors, English nobles, European princes. Even her sister's widower were Philip without commitment. This marriage game provided diplomatic leverage while preserving independence. Mary's unhappy experience with Philip served as powerful warning, again sacrificing autonomy for a traditional queenly role. The contrast between sisters extended to personal style. Mary had maintained Spanish-influenced formality, elaborate dark clothing, religious jewelry, and structured court ceremony. Elizabeth developed distinctively English royal aesthetic, rich but variable clothing, secular symbolism, and more flexible etiquette. This national distinctiveness appealed to emerging patriotic sentiment while distinguishing her reign from her half-Spanish sisters. As Elizabeth's reign progressed, Mary's memory faded from public consciousness. The new queen made no direct criticism of her sister, but allowed Mary's reputation to diminish through neglect rather than active destruction. Official histories emphasized Elizabeth's legitimacy, or quietly obscuring Mary's precedent as England's first undisputed queen. Court propaganda focused on direct connection to Henry VIII, rather than continuity with Mary's rule. For Catholic subjects, this marginalization of Mary represented painful erasure. The Catholic queen had restored ancient faith, repaired broken religious communities, and reconnected England with Rome. Her death and Elizabeth's religious settlement forced Catholics into difficult choices: outward conformity with private Catholic practice, exile to continental Catholic communities, or dangerous recusancy, risking financial penalties and eventually imprisonment. Elizabeth's government initially maintained relative tolerance toward private Catholic worship, focusing on public conformity rather than personal belief. This pragmatic approach reflected lessons from Mary's reign. Persecution created martyrs rather than converts. Over time, however, Catholic threats to Elizabeth's rule, papal excommunication in 1570, assassination plots, and Spanish invasion attempts led to increasingly harsh anti-Catholic legislation. Despite these religious differences, the sisters shared fundamental challenges as female rulers in a male-dominated world. Both faced questions about their legitimacy, capacity, and authority. Both navigated marriage politics with potential threats to independence. Both managed factional court politics without male authority to reinforce decisions. Their different approaches to these challenges reflected personality, circumstances, and timing rather than fundamental capacity. Together, Mary and Elizabeth demonstrated that women could rule in their own right, permanently altering English understanding of monarchy. Before Mary, England had never had an undisputed queenant. Matilda's 12th century claim had led to civil war rather than accepted female rule. After Elizabeth, female succession became accepted legal principle, enabling later queens from Mary II to Victoria to Elizabeth II. The sisters also established different models of queenship. Mary pioneered traditional female monarchy, ruling with king consort, maintaining feminine pursuits alongside royal duties and seeking dynastic continuity through childbearing. Elizabeth developed alternative approach, ruling without consort, creating unique gender presentation, and establishing non-biological succession. These contrasting examples expanded possibilities for female leadership beyond their lifetimes. By the 1560s, Elizabeth had established patterns that would characterize her entire 45-year reign. She maintained religious moderation despite pressure from Protestant reformers for more thorough change. She entertained marriage proposals without commitment. She balanced factional interests, rather than allowing any group to dominate policy. She displayed personal glamour while maintaining administrative efficiency. This steady governance contrasted with Mary's troubled 5 years, which had seen religious persecution, war with France, loss of Killala, economic difficulties, and failed pregnancy. The elder sister's reign came to seem brief interruption rather than significant chapter in Tudor history. The younger sister's longevity, Elizabeth would eventually rule longer than her father. Brother and sister combined allowed her to reshape English memory. Yet Mary's reign provided essential foundation for Elizabeth's success. Without Mary's precedent, proving a woman could claim the crown despite opposition, Elizabeth might never have secured succession. Without Mary's mistakes, demonstrating the dangers of religious extremism, Elizabeth might not have adopted pragmatic moderation. Without Mary's Spanish marriage illustrating foreign alliance risks, Elizabeth might not have maintained independence. The Tudor sisters, different in temperament, religion, and governance style, nonetheless shared exceptional historical significance. Together they demonstrated female capacity for sovereignty, navigated unprecedented challenges, and established England's national identity during critical transition from medieval to early modern state. Their contrasting reigns, Mary's brief, troubled rule, and Elizabeth's long-celebrated sovereignty provided complementary lessons about effective queenship. For ordinary Tudor people, The reigns of Mary and Elizabeth demonstrated monarchy's profound impact on daily existence. Religious policy determined worship practices, church decoration, fast days, and community rituals. Foreign relations affected trade, taxation, and security. Court patronage influenced cultural production. What books were printed, what plays performed, what music composed. The sisters' different approaches shaped not just high politics, but everyday experience. As Elizabeth's reign continued its course, Mary's troubled rule faded into a historical footnote rather than living memory. The elder sister's dreams of Catholic restoration dissolved as Protestant settlement took root. The younger sister's pragmatic policies built national confidence and cultural flourishing, yet both contributed essential chapters to England's story, demonstrating female leadership's possibilities and pitfalls. The sisters, who had shared Tudor blood, but opposed two divisions, would eventually share burial space in Westminster Abbey. Mary's final wish to be buried beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, remained unfulfilled. Instead, she rested in the Lady Chapel until Elizabeth's death in 603, when James II ordered construction of a magnificent tomb containing both queens. The inscription, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection, united in death." The women whose lives had diverged so dramatically, this shared monument represented fitting conclusion to their intertwined stories. Despite religious division, political competition, and personal suspicion, Mary and Elizabeth remained connected by blood, experience, and historical significance. They represented different versions of Tudor queenship, but faced common challenges as women ruling a man's world. Their contrasting reigns, Catholic and Protestant, Spanish-influenced and English nationalist, traditional and innovative, demonstrated female monarchy's remarkable adaptability. Together, the Tudor sisters permanently altered English understanding of royal succession, female authority, and national identity. Mary proved women could claim the crown despite opposition. Elizabeth demonstrated women could rule effectively without male partnership. Their reigns established precedent for later female monarchs, while expanding cultural possibilities for women's leadership beyond royal context. For the Tudor sisters, the journey from princesses to queens had proven dangerous, difficult, and transformative. Mary had endured religious persecution, political marginalization, personal humiliation before claiming her birthright. Elizabeth had survived accusation, imprisonment, and constant suspicion before achieving sovereignty. Both had demonstrated extraordinary resilience in a world designed for male leadership, or different fates. Mary's troubled 5-year reign versus Elizabeth's celebrated 45-year rule reflected circumstance as much as character. Mary inherited religious division, married unwisely, and suffered health problems beyond Tudor medicine's limited capacity. Elizabeth benefited from Mary's precedent, maintained independence, and enjoyed better health until old age. Their contrasting stories demonstrate both individual agency and historical contingency. The Tudor princesses who became Tudor queens left lasting legacy through their struggles, achievements, and contrasting approaches to female sovereignty. Mary pioneered women's right to inherit England's crown. Elizabeth established women's capacity to rule without male partnership. Together, they created foundation for later female monarchs, while expanding cultural imagination regarding women's leadership. As night falls and your thoughts begin to drift, imagine those Tudor sisters separated by religion but united by blood. Different in approach but similar in courage. Opponents in life but companions in death. Their remarkable journey from vulnerable princesses to ruling queens transformed not just their own lives, but England's understanding of monarchy itself. And with that, close your eyes and drift off to sleep.